Yeah, we're on.
Yep.
Okay, so Gavin and I are back to talk about the second half of Coyne's book. And before we do that, we're gonna sort of do some clear up some businessy sort of stuff. So after this week, we will have after this week, do we just have one more week of classes?
Yep.
It's this week and next week. I was thinking we had three. Wow, it's going even faster than I thought. And it's already going fast. Okay, so today we will talk about the second half of Coyne. That's chapters 3, 4, and 5. Right? It ends on chapter 5, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And next week, we will talk about David Benatar's book, The Human Predicament. The subtitle is A Candid Guide to Life's Biggest Questions. And we will cover the whole book next week. It's a shorter book. Gavin and I were just talking about this. It's true that it's about 200 pages. On the other hand, the pages are about half the size of the pages of the books that we've been reading. So we think it's about the same amount of reading, maybe a little bit more. But you know, it's the last book we'll read for the class. That will wrap it up. And just to encourage you to read it and to continue, staying engaged with the class and with discussion questions and responses, and your reaction papers. Please note that your final exam will include one question, at least one question, probably one question from each book. That means one question from Benatar's book as well. All of which is to say, please, stay with it. We're almost there, and do please spend the time and reading and thinking about Benatar's book. I think you'll appreciate it, having read the more sort of specialized books we've read up to this point. And just to remind us, we started with Darwin's Origin of Species. Okay, and then from there, we got an update on evolution and sort of the conflicts or apparent conflicts between evolution and science, or evolution and religion, or science and religion. Darwin introduced that conflict, or he didn't introduce it, but he really showcased it in his book, in his arguments against special creation. Then we read The Greatest Show on Earth. We broke that up into 2 weeks, and that was really intended as an update on what we know about evolution by natural selection in terms of the evidence, and also to provide an update on some of the arguments that have been put forward by religious groups and creationists, and typically under a different name, but nevertheless, the conflicts, I think, are real, as both Darwin and Dawkins have suggested, and they have, and the attempts to resolve them have continued to this day. So then what we did after Greatest Show on Earth, we moved into a much more focused assessment of the potential conflicts between faith and fact, or science and religion, or evolution and religion. And we last week discussed the first half of Jerry Coyne's book, Faith versus Fact, Why Science and Religion Are Incompatible. And Gavin and I mentioned last time that, there's no doubt that Jerry Coyne has a very clear, straightforward perspective on this. He has argued that faith and fact, or religion and evolution, or religion and science, are deeply and irrevocably incompatible. And that's one of the reasons I think this is a good book to read, because it's so clear. You don't have to wonder what he's arguing. You don't have to, sort of try to ferret out what he may or may not be saying. It's very clear what his arguments are, and therefore I think it's much clearer for the reader. You don't have to burn up a lot of cognitive energy thinking about, trying to figure out what he's arguing. So we will talk about the second half of Coyne's book, where he addresses why accommodationism fails. He argues that it fails. That's chapter 3. Chapter 4 is a chapter that he calls Faith Strikes Back. And this is essentially his discussion of the many ways in which science itself, including evolutionary science, but science more generally, has been criticized by faith and by religion and by well, not by faith and religion, but by religionists, people who have faith that they believe to be in conflict with science. One of the ways that they've sort of tackled this is to tackle science and attempt to, undo science. So that's the chapter on Faith Strikes Back. And then the final chapter, I think, is a very interesting chapter and probably unsettling for many of you if you weren't aware of this. But this is Coyne's attempt to lay out why it matters that faith and science, faith and religion, or faith and fact, or religion and evolution, or more broadly, science and non-scientific thinking, why it matters. And he focuses on several areas in which it unquestionably matters. And in which religion and science in particular are deeply in conflict, such as in those denominations or religions that disallow the practice of medical science. So they disallow their adherents to seek modern medical intervention, and so you have thousands of children dying each year. And if you think about around the world, it's not a one-off sort of occurrence where children are not provided with medical intervention that could save their life because the parents have decided that they're going to rely on prayer or rely on some other non-evidence-based means of treatment. And that, I think, is a fairly straightforward case of conflict. But we'll get to that. And we just wanted to mention, so we'll finish up Coyne today. And again, just to be super clear, please take the time to read Benatar's book. Benatar's book, what we're doing with this last book here is asking you to sort of step back now. We've focused for the last several weeks on science and whether or not it is whether or not it's in conflict with non-scientific thinking, superstitious thinking, religious thinking, and where those conflicts might lie. And for much of that time, we've spent comparing and contrasting a science or evidence-based perspective on life and the diversity of life, and against a religious perspective or a non-evidence-based or a faith-based perspective on life. And so with Darwin, it was evolution by natural selection as contrasted with creationism, special creation. Then with Dawkins, it was an update on evolution by natural selection as contrasted with the many varied ways in which religious thinking has been sort of massaged in the modern world. And then Coyne, of course, he's asking you to make this. In some sense, he's still maintaining that focus on evolution, but he's also stepping back a little bit more broadly and talking about science versus non-science, faith versus fact. Now, with our final book, with Benatar, Benatar's a philosopher, and he's asking the reader to step back further even. That's what we're asking you as the students to do, and to think a little more broadly about, what it means to think about life and death and birth and topics that are difficult, to think about these topics from an evidence-based perspective and from a non-evidence-based perspective, or a science-based perspective and a non-science-based perspective. Often that will amount to science versus religion, but not always. I mean, there are many ways in which one can proceed in a non-science-based sort of way. So this is sort of the way to sort of step back broadly and wrap things up with a bird's eye view of the social, life, and biological sciences. Okay, so hopefully you guys will enjoy Benatar's book, although you may find it unsettling in several places. Presumably that was also true with our first 3 books. But before we talk about the second half of Coyne's book, we wanted to just mention, encourage you to continue. There's only 2 weeks left of class, right? There's this week and then there's next week. I guess we're cheerleading and encouraging you as strongly as we can to Continue submitting your discussion questions. Continue submitting your responses to at least 2 other students' questions. Continue submitting your reaction papers. It all adds up. And again, remember that 75% of your course grade can be settled even before we get to the final exam. And you can have a rock solid A if you're turning everything in. Your final exam, incidentally, will be far more straightforward to the extent that you've been keeping up with the reading, with the discussion questions, with the responses, with the reaction papers, and with and with watching these videos, which we hope are useful. Now, for this week, we were asking you to see several videos. Actually, and Gavin will post these. We're asking you to watch two-part series. Okay, the first is called "The Root of All Evil" with a question mark. The Root of All Evil. This is a series written, directed, and narrated by Richard Dawkins, the author of our second book. And it has 2 parts, and this is basically his effort to critically appraise religion. The first part is called The God Delusion. The second part is called The Virus of Faith. Once again, I don't think you'll find it difficult to sort of appreciate where he's coming from. You may vehemently disagree, but you will understand where he's coming from. And that's all we ask, so that you understand what he's arguing. So each one of those is 50 minutes. And then the second 2-part series is called The Enemies of Reason. This is a much broader assessment of the distinction between faith versus fact, or science versus non-science in its varied forms. The first part of that 2-part series is called Slaves to Superstition, and the second part is called The Irrational Health Service. So it's kind of interesting. The second part really gets into some of the non-evidence-based medical or pseudo-medical practices that are engaged in. And so we hope this will sort of help to enliven some of the text, particularly from Coyne's book. So there are those two-part series, and then we have just one more class, one more week after that. Gavin, is there anything else that we need to say or anything else we want to add? Our things are going well, I presume, with the discussion questions, it sounds like.
Mm-hmm. Yep, everyone's doing a great job. Everyone who's participating, which is most of the students.
Good.
With both the discussion forum, and responding to each other's questions, and also with your reaction papers. So.
Excellent. Well, I've taught this class many, many times over many, many years, and I can tell you that the single best predictor of doing well in this class is keeping up, is turning stuff in. People who turn stuff in consistently do better on the final. Again, it's just not magic. It's hard work. It takes time, but there is a payoff. You do well in the class, and incidentally, we hope that many of you learn something. That is, after all, for many of you, I would hope, the goal. But nevertheless, there you have it. Why don't we talk about chapter 3?
Okay. Yep. So as we were talking about, this chapter does sort of break up the different arguments for why accommodationism fails.
Wait, Gavin, so let's talk about, in your own words, what does he mean by accommodationism?
So I think it would not be incorrect to say that Jerry Coyne paints accommodationism, and I think he paints it accurately, as sort of making room in science for religion. He talks a lot about the God of the gaps in these last 3 chapters, and I think that he makes a decent argument that not only is it dangerous for God to fill the gaps that are supposedly strewn about different scientific theories, but I think also he makes a good case that God sort of wedges himself in gaps where there aren't any in the first place. And I think that's maybe good way to start explaining accommodationism, or maybe in other words, making I don't know how else to say it other than making
Yeah.
accommodations in science for faith or faith-based truth claims about the universe and the natural world. So faith sort of intruding on ways of knowing that science is more well equipped to deal with.
Yes. I mean, yeah, you've covered a number of different levels at which you can think about, or we can think about, accommodationism. I mean, very basically, you said it. It's the effort. Accommodationism is the effort that's been made by those in the scientific community or by those in the religious community to be friends, basically, right? It's scientists. It's an effort by anyone, scientist or religionist, to find common ground among science and religion, or science and non-science. And as Coyne points out, and I think as Gavin, in your response, I think makes that clear, that there are many ways in which it is possible to talk about accommodationism. Okay, when you're thinking about science and religion, we'll just talk about science and religion, since science is the typical way we're referring to when we say fact. Typically, we're talking about science, and when we say faith, religion. But I hope everybody understands that these are just two of the broadest ways in which to think about evidence-based thinking and non-evidence-based thinking. So there are, as Coyne discusses, beginning on page 99, there are many varieties of accommodationism. Beginning with what he calls logical compatibility. Okay, this is, as he says, this argument is used but rarely, for its claim is merely that there's no logical reason why religion and science are incompatible. He says it could be true, for instance, that deities or gods or God exist who have never interfered with the workings of the universe. Okay, but that would mean that accommodationism, that would be a claim of logical compatibility, and that would be evidence of accommodation. To the extent that there was no logical incompatibility, well, you could say, well, then they are in agreement, or they are in accord, or they accommodate one another. He says, alternatively, there could be religions that alter their doctrines every time one becomes incompatible with a new finding of science, or with reason itself. Such beliefs, though compatible with science, are almost non-existent as well. Ultra-liberal forms of Christianity, like those that accept a personal God but deny miracles, such as the resurrection, may accept science but nevertheless still defy reason by making unsubstantiated claims. So this business of logical compatibility, okay, this is simply the claim that there is no logical reason why science and religion are incompatible. And that's true. There's no logical, it could be the case that science, provides a clear window to truth, and is not at all incompatible with religion. So there is no logically necessary reason why they must be incompatible. Okay, but that's typically not the argument that's made by those who wish to advance accommodationism. The most common, Coyne argues, is what he calls mental compatibility. Okay, he says this is the most common, it's on page 99, though hardly the most convincing argument for accommodationism. Basically, the argument is, well, there are many religious scientists and there are many religious people who appreciate science, and so therefore they can't be incompatible. But that's not a very powerful argument, because one way to get there is simply to have, for people to have, the ability to compartmentalize. You can have. It can be the case that there are outstanding scientists who are also religious. But what it means is that they're able to compartmentalize thinking based on evidence and thinking based on faith. That doesn't mean, therefore, that science writ large and religion writ large are compatible or can comfortably and logically accommodate one another. It just means that people are capable of holding two contradictory sets of beliefs at the same time. Does that make sense, Kevin?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
I like the way he summarizes it on 100. He says, this form of accommodationism confuses coexistence with compatibility. Right?
Mm-hmm.
The fact that there are scientists, wonderful, let's just be extreme. The fact that there are evolutionary biologists who happen to be religious doesn't therefore mean, according to Coyne, that science and religion are utterly compatible. It just means, according to Coyne, that some religious people or some scientists have the ability to, basically focus their, can compartmentalize their thinking, and they can walk into the lab to do their science and leave their critical, evidence-based thinking when they walk into the, to their house of worship.
Right. And I assume he's here talking about scientists who believe in like a personal God, because of course, like some sort of vague, abstract belief in a non-personal, spiritual sort of force wouldn't necessarily need to conflict with science or any scientific claims.
Absolutely, and that's a really good point. And remember that Coyne's definition of religion is a theistic religion, where there's a personal God who interacts with an individual and actually has effects on the world, which is most believers. Most believers, I think something around 60%, are, worship a God that is a personal God, rather than the sort of ground of all being kind of spirit God that may not have any impact and may not be believed to have any impact on individual lives and on evidence-based reality.
Right.
So the next section, he talks about syncretism. And, I think the best way to sum this up, so he defines syncretism as, he uses the Oxford English Dictionary's definition, the attempted union or reconciliation of diverse or opposite tenets or practices, especially in philosophy or religion. And then he says, when discussing science and religion, syncretists, this is just like a version of accommodationism. Syncretists claim that they are two sides of a single practice, finding truth. Okay, so a syncretic accommodationist would be someone who argues that, no, they're two equally valuable and respectable ways to find truth.
I think, if I'm understanding it correctly, and I think to help students distinguish this from logical compatibility, because I think they could potentially sound similar.
Yes.
Syncretism sounds more like the argument that science and religion have different territories. They are both, syncretism claims that they are both capable of finding truths, but the truths they are capable of finding are distinct from one another. Science cannot find faith or religious truths, and vice versa. I think is more so the argument with syncretism, as opposed to logical compatibility, which says that they can both find the same truths and not be in conflict with one another.
Yes. No, thank you. I think that does clarify things. I just find it so muddy thinking about it like this. I don't really understand how someone can, sort of get lured by these arguments. But at any rate, that's just me. But he says on page 103, he's talking about different varieties of syncretism. And towards the middle of that page, at the beginning of a paragraph there in the middle of the page, he says, other syncretists argue that it's impossible for science to contradict religion because science, devoted to understanding how God's creation works, must comport with religious belief. I mean, one version of this is, God created everything. He created the methods of science. He created the means of fact detection. And therefore, the means of identifying what is truth. And so it's impossible for science to be incompatible with religion. And that just seems like, I guess, what Dawkins would have called special pleading. Yeah, it doesn't really help me understand how they're not incompatible. Just to say they're not incompatible, that's basically what it amounts to, is saying, well, God did everything, so whatever science learns, that's from God. Whatever religion provides, that's from God. But that's like skipping the part where you provide the logical, rationale. But I think that's still part of, syncretism. You're arguing that they're either two sides of the same coin or two ways to proceed, may not interfere with the other.
Right. And I think he sort of sums up the difficulty with that argument on that very next paragraph. But such claims look silly when the two areas provide answers that are irreconcilable. So,
right. And how can that be? Right. You want to ask, how could it be that you're reaching two different conclusions that cannot possibly, be the case? One would think that, one might ask where one went off the track.
right.
So, yeah, I mean, from my perspective, although I don't find, the mental, when he's talking about, the syncretism where he's talking about, he mentions Kenneth Miller, for example. There are scientists, there's no doubt that there are scientists who are religious. And that is very commonly used as evidence that science and religion are compatible. I understand how that's used as evidence. It's very weak. Frankly, I think it's weak. It's not very powerful evidence, but, it's plain as day. There are scientists who are religious. There certainly are religious people who appreciate the value and the utility of science. But the fact that these two groups of people exist doesn't therefore mean that science and religion are compatible. It means that they can be held, in the mind by a given person.
Right. And I think even making that argument still only moves it back. I think you'd have to, I wouldn't be satisfied until you then asked, well, okay, how do those people reconcile those two things?
Right. Well, how about if we move to the Noma gambit, which he's with Coyne starts on page 106.
Yep. Non-overlapping magisteria.
Yeah, and so, the argument here, and this is a very famous argument put forward by Stephen Jay Gould, who was a biologist at Harvard. He was certainly, he wasn't religious. He's since died, but he was a wonderful writer, and he's probably the person or the scientist that most Americans get their evolutionary knowledge from in terms of his books. I mean, they sell, at least they sell much better than Dawkins's books, for example, in the United States. And Gould is sort of the quintessential accommodationist. He argues that science and religion are non-overlapping magisteria, noma, non-overlapping magisteria. There are two approaches to finding two different sets of truths, basically. Science is focused on, sort of the machinations of the world, the how things work. And religion, according to Gould, is focused on morals, values, and, sort of ethics. And never the two shall meet, according to Gould. The problem with Noma is that scientists don't buy it, but then religious people don't buy it either. People do want to make claims about the way the world works. Okay, they do want to make claims about evidence-based reality, and scientists, for their part, have done extraordinary work on morals and ethics and values. From without, sort of a religious, perspective.
Right.
So, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, So this seems sort of like one of the syncretist arguments that they sort of the the syncretist argument. It sounds like, which is that faith and science have different non-overlapping territories in which they are allowed to slightly different from the syncretist argument, because I think Stephen Jay Gould did not seem to be saying that religion has territory in which it can make truth claims. It just has territory in which it can sort of inform philosophy and morality. But even that, I think Coyne makes a good argument, is not really convincing. Even if that were the case, even if people did stay in those two if people did sort of stay in their lanes or stayed in their territory, I still don't think that would be convincing. Not to mention the fact that is not often what happens.
That's right. That's right. So the next several sections of this chapter basically test this out, this noma idea, non-overlapping magisteria. I mean, in some sense. And so he makes the case, Coyne makes the case that on page 114, he says, nearly all religions make empirical claims about how God interacts with the world, although some of them are hard or impossible to test. Now remember, from Gould's perspective, proper religion, as he calls it, proper religion does not make claims about the world, does not make empirical claims about the world, proper religion. Well, people who are religious don't like this because they think that Jesus really did live, and he really did die, and he really was resurrected, and he really was the Son of God, and Mary really was, did experience Immaculate Conception. They don't think it's, they believe, I mean, these are part of the tenets of Christianity, for example. And they do make empirical claims. And that's just what Coyne is arguing, is that they certainly do make empirical claims. And to that extent, they don't fit the definition of proper religion, as Gould has argued. Essentially, Gould's defining it in such a way that what would be proper religion would be like a religion without a personal God, or a religion without a God that actually interfaced with reality. Mm-hmm. And most religious people just don't. That's not their religion. That's how they see things. God really does exist, according to them. Or for Christians, Jesus really did, die on the cross, and he really was resurrected. And so right there, I mean, this is part of the reason that Noma, while very well known, and while Gould did write beautifully about these non-overlapping magisteria, nobody actually buys it. Nobody among scientists, or very few among scientists, and very few among religionists. But he had a gift. He had a gift for writing. And I think people want it to be so, that there is a way in which these two domains can be compatible or can accommodate one another. So Coyne goes through various ways, various empirical claims that have been made and that religions do make, and that can be tested. So you look at on page 114, here's a claim: intercessory prayer can heal the sick or regrow amputated limbs. Let's just say, you could even say it a little more, I suppose a little less focused. Prayer matters. That's an empirical claim, that actually praying has an effect. I mean, people do it because they think it's going to have an effect. They think it matters. And yet in every test, and it has been empirically investigated, prayer does not work. Okay? People who are prayed for do not heal faster or, more quickly get better. And this has been, there have been several studies that have been funded both by the government as well as by private foundations, where they actually test the effects of so-called intercessory prayer. This is prayer by others, on one's behalf. And the evidence is completely null. I mean, you don't find any effects. And then people who believe in prayer will say, well, God doesn't want to be tested. Or, God can't be tested. But then Coyne gives several examples directly from the Bible where God is happy to be tested and provides clear evidence for his existence. And then, of course, when the results turn out so that, if they had turned out where prayer did have an effect, you can bet that the religious people would have said, aha, see, this evidence for God.
Right.
So,
And
yeah.
I think that the claims he's making on page 114 are good examples of the types of things that many adherents to different religion would be unwilling to give up. And the
Right.
things that they are unwilling to sort of concede are exactly those things that do overlap and overlap with science and overstep sort of their boundaries in terms of, or according to Stephen Jay Gould's NOMA argument.
Right. All right. So this brings us to the section, just moving forward, and feel free to, ratchet it back if you want, but I want to make sure we get through, some of the bigger issues in these last 3 chapters.
Okay.
He has a section on what about miracles? And I think, let's see. He brings up David Hume's principle. Where does he write about that initially? Hold on. Okay. So at the bottom of page 121, the classic test for the truth of miracles is that of the Scottish philosopher David Hume. Foreshadowing Carl Sagan's principle of extraordinary evidence, Hume claimed that miracles were so extraordinary, to the extent that they existed, they were so extraordinary that to accept them, you would have to regard the suspension of nature's laws as more likely than any other explanation, including fraud or mistakes. Okay, so then he goes on to say, well, why don't let me finish this section here. When weighing evidence, this is top of page 122, when weighing evidence for non-miraculous explanations, you should also consider if the witnesses stand to benefit from describing the miracle. Because we know that mistakes, fraud, and confirmation bias aren't that rare, okay, to Hume, they became the default explanation. Using this principle, if you reject the eyewitness testimony of 11 Mormons as fraud, error, or delusion, then you must also reject the resurrection. So what he's arguing is that for any purported miracle, you would have to, that the miracle, that the event, that the likelihood that the event was miraculous, okay, would have to be greater than the likelihood that the purported miracle was fraudulent or based on faulty eyewitness testimony or a flat-out lie, or just an attempt to bring people together, for example. I mean, the bottom line is that there are many more probable explanations that have to be ruled out before you take the incredible step of accepting something as evidence for a god or gods. Because there are more parsimonious explanations.
Right. And I think here's a good place to sort of anticipate the possible counter argument that I've heard people make, and I think sounds very reasonable at first, which is, oh, well, in reference to like some particular miracle and someone doubts it, and the believer in the miracle might say something along the lines of, oh, well, then, what evidence will be good enough for you? Or, nothing will be good enough for these, for the scientists or the adherents of evolution. If they don't believe in this, then, they won't believe in anything, or no evidence for faith will be good enough. And they seem to be making the argument that they're biased against believing in miracles, and that they're sort of, they require an inordinate amount of evidence in order to accept something as a miracle. But what I think is a better explanation, at least for most people, for most scientists who are doubtful or suspicious of miracles, is that they're applying the same critical lens and the same scrutiny as they would to any scientific claim that they tested in their lab or in their own experiments. And I think Coyne makes that point here and elsewhere throughout these last 3 chapters.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And actually, Coyne thinks that Hume himself went a little too far. It's kind of interesting. On page 124, he's near the top of the page, he says, "Does Hume's criterion mean then that we can never accept miracles? I don't think so, according to Coyne, for Hume took it too far. No amount of evidence, it seems, could ever override his conviction that miracles were really the result of fraud, ignorance, or misrepresentation. Yet, perhaps there are some events, though they're hard to imagine, when a divinely produced violation of nature's laws is more likely than human error or deception. It would be a closed-minded scientist," says Coyne, "who would say that miracles are impossible in principle." I actually think that's a good point.
Mm-hmm.
Hume was right, he says, about one thing. To have real confidence in a miracle, one needs evidence, massive, well-documented, and either replicated or independently corroborated evidence from multiple and reliable sources. No religious miracle even comes close to meeting those standards. So at one point, Coyne, I don't know if we've already passed this or if it's coming, but he says, well, what evidence would he need to believe that Jesus was the Son of God? And so he goes through this elaborate sort of, basically, well, if a spirit came down from the sky, and other people verified that they were seeing the same thing, and it could be, if there was independent corroboration, and so on and so forth.
Right.
In other words, there is evidence that could be secured that would be in favor of the miracle's occurrence, as opposed to against the miracle's occurrence. And that's just the point, is that Coyne argues that religions do make empirical claims, and often, not always, these empirical claims can be tested. And to the extent that evidence that you should see if a religion is, approximating the truth, to the extent that there is evidence you should see but don't see, the parsimonious conclusion is that tentatively you presume the God doesn't exist.
Right.
If there's no evidence for Thor's hammer, well then it's possible that Thor's hammer is invisible, or all the other special pleading that could be involved. But the tentative conclusion is that Thor doesn't exist. And that's part of what he's arguing.
Mm-hmm. And
it also means that evidence could be provided that is in favor of Thor's existence.
And I think he makes that point even more strongly later. I can't remember if it's in this chapter, but when he talks about Carl Sagan's dragon in the garage,
yes,
with the more reasonable explanation being that the dragon doesn't exist in where evidence should exist. I think that was a really strong argument that I actually had never heard before, but I really liked his reasoning. But we can talk more about that.
Sure. We'll do that when we get there. How about that?
Yeah.
It's coming up, isn't it? I don't want to. I feel like it's right at the end of this chapter.
That's what I thought.
Yeah. Oh, whoops, I went too far. Let me just look real quick while we're talking about it. Let me see if I can find it in the index. I'm sure we can. Sagan, let's see. 93, 118, 119. I think we just passed it. Well, I don't see it there. Let's see, 203. Maybe that's where it is. Way into Faith Strikes Back, then. Oh yeah, there it is. It's on page 203.
Yep.
The point here, Coyne is here talking about, he's using this as another example to sort of hammer home the idea that, well, he says here, bottom page 202. In other words, the absence of evidence, if evidence should be there, is indeed evidence of absence.
Right.
Carl Sagan's Dragon in My Garage essay in his book, The Demon Haunted World, which incidentally I've used in this class before.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's a great book. And, well, that book, Carl Sagan's book, just for the record, he very carefully avoids religion. He talks about all manner of non-scientific, non-evidence-based thinking. He talks about alien abduction. He talks about clairvoyance, ESP, water divination, and but he never tackles religion. And I think it's a strategic move on his part to get people to think critically. But then, I think he wants to avoid the conflict. Well, he's no longer alive, but I think he wanted to avoid the conflict with religion specifically. So what I've done in the past is had students read Sagan's book, and we all talk about, why, based on critical thinking, ESP is not likely to be, a real phenomenon, or water divination. That's where you try to find where water is using these two metal rods. There's no evidence for this. And we can all see this, or tarot card reading, or palm reading. There's just no evidence that any of this, is legitimate. And so we apply that kind of thinking in these domains other than religion. And then what I've had students do in the past is then we'll read Richard Dawkins's The God Delusion, where we basically apply the same critical thinking to religion. And I think it can be very, insightful, very instructive for students to apply that same thinking to many of their own, or to others' religious beliefs.
Right.
Okay, so let's just pop back, and I think very helpfully, Coyne goes through 3 test cases. Let's see. He says, how does he set this up exactly? Well, basically, he goes through, so he says, when science disproves religious beliefs that are negotiable, that is, parts of church doctrine that aren't critical parts of belief, the faithful are often happy to simply jettison them. Not always, but often. Blah, blah, blah. Let's see. Not all beliefs are negotiable. So he says, so he takes us through some recent scientific evidence that essentially is, it directly contradicts the religious story or the religious belief set. So Adam and Eve, for example, there is now very, very clear evidence, replicable, repeated by independent observers. All of this evidence suggests that the human species never, it could not have ever dwindled to as few as 2 people.
Right.
No, based on the existing genetic variation, it is not possible that the human species was ever represented by 2 individuals, and therefore Adam and Eve simply cannot have existed. Okay? All of the evidence we have.
Right.
Now,
oh, sorry,
yeah,
go ahead. No, I was just gonna agree with that, and that he is in this section tackling faiths that, or beliefs that are non-negotiable, and that this is the big one for Christianity, and that, like you said, there is extremely strong evidence that, that's just not how humans descended from a common ancestor with chimpanzees.
And then furthermore, even if, let's just imagine that you're trying to make sense of this, and you could argue, well, maybe Adam and Eve were the first humans that evolved from non-humans, but that won't work either, okay? Because the genetic variation that exists today if you do the relevant modeling based on the available data, you can't make it so that the human species ever, in any point in its history, could be reduced to two single people. All the evidence suggests that the smallest number of humans that must have existed is something like 12,500, right? I mean, in other words, several thousand. I mean, I think this, for many Christians, might be a negotiable. I mean, for many, it's not negotiable, right? They say, no, it has to be that Adam and Eve. Otherwise, the whole thing falls apart.
Right.
But there are, in fact, Christians who have let go of that and who basically make a very, kind of a special pleading case that, well, not actually a single man and a single woman. What Genesis was referring to, or what God was meaning, was a small group of men and women. But that's not what he said. That's not what the book says. And so, then you get into, well, how do you know who's right here? Well, he's right because I say he's right here. There's really there's nothing for it. I mean, what we know from the evidence is that Adam and Eve, as a single individual male and a single individual female, cannot and did not exist. Now, that much is true. If you want to make sense of that, you've got to figure out some other way to do it.
Right. Some form of like taking the creation myth or creation story of Genesis as some sort of metaphor, but I mean, at that point,
Right.
you're, leaving behind all sorts of details that seem to be pretty clearly stated in the religious text.
Yes, absolutely. So it's a problem. This new scientific evidence, directly contradicts the story. Call it a metaphor, call it, whatever you want to call it, of Adam and Eve. The second test case is Mormonism and the origin of Native Americans. Mormon doctrine is very clear that Native Americans descended from Middle Eastern people, right? I mean, this is the teaching. The problem is that's simply not the case. Native American peoples, descended from Asian peoples, East Asians in particular.
Mm-hmm. And there's clear genetic evidence of their similarity.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And so, once again, you have to do some mental gymnastics, I suppose, if you want to get around this. Just deny it. They'll just say that's not true, and they're just throwing out, all the studies that, all the DNA, all the molecular genetic studies. They just say it's fabricated, it's false, it's not true.
Mm-hmm.
But you can't just declare something untrue by fiat just because you say it's untrue. I mean, again, this is evidence that's been accumulated now for decades from multiple independent labs. And, there's, again, as Coyne has talked about, there's a great incentive to show that, to document that someone was wrong. And it just hasn't been done. So this is a test case in the sense that the data just don't bear out that particular religious doctrine. And that's no skin off, non-Mormon Christians, because they never claimed that to begin with. And so it's a little easier for non-Mormon Christians to stomach in a way that perhaps the Adam and Eve example is more difficult for people who, consider themselves Christians.
Right. And, yep, then he moves on to theistic evolution.
Yep.
Which I don't remember how exactly he defines theistic evolution, or what the popular sort of idea of it is.
So probably the most common way in which, theistic evolution is promulgated, certainly in the Western world, is, evolution occurred, but it was God-guided. It was guided by God. Or evolution occurred all the way to humans, but there was a special moment, according to Catholics, where the soul was injected. it's evolution by natural selection in some way informed by or manipulated by or interfered with by a god. Okay? And he argues that anywhere this has been attempted, the evidence just doesn't bear it out. Okay, so for example, with regard to the Catholic teaching that evolution by natural selection is fact, it's true, it's all true, even for humans, except don't forget that God placed a soul in each individual human and only in humans. Okay, and that's how they then open, the Catholic teachings box, is that humans, unlike any other life form, have a soul. But then, as Coyne notes, okay, there's no empirical evidence for either a soul or its unique presence in humans. Coyne contends, and others, that it's religious add-on to a scientific theory. And why is it being added on? Because it needs to be added on in order to retain the belief set that humans are made in God's image, or, are somehow the special keepers of God's teachings. But that's not a reason to bring something on board because it's demanded by the religious teachings. I mean, it's difficult. It's more difficult to see that if you do ascribe to Catholic beliefs. But of course, it's very easy for a Muslim to see the problem with that, or let's just say for a Mormon to see the problem with that. But that's just the point: is that that's a conflict. It's an incompatibility. It's kind of like jimmying with the evidence and with the theory so that it's consistent with the belief system. I mean, why do Catholics insist that a soul was inserted into humans? Well, they insist that because the Pope said it so. Okay, well, what if you don't think the Pope is a conduit of God? Then what? You know what I mean? The belief system exists in order to make the whole thing work. And then you might as well just go, as Coyne says, why trouble with this whole business of God inserting a soul? Why bother with evolution?
Right. Why not reject it flat out, the whole thing?
Yeah. Why not just go, Southern Baptist and say, no, the Genesis story is true. And there is no such thing as evolution. And that's the problem, is that there's no empirically definitive way to pick between the different belief systems. Which suggests, and they all can't be right. They can't all be right. The one true religion is, after all, the one true religion. They can't all be the one true religions. And if that's true, if that's the case, then how do you know which one is the one true one? You don't. You can't. And that suggests that it might not be unreasonable to propose that they're all wrong. Or I suppose that they're all right, but then you've got a whole nother can of worms.
Right.
Out.
Especially the ones that directly conflict with one another, or
sure.
claim that the other religions are flatly wrong.
Or even within a single religion. I mean, how can a Southern Baptist convince a Catholic that evolution is false? When the Pope, the most revered figure in Catholicism, has told them that religion is true. Either evolution occurred or it did not. It seems to me that there's nothing that a Southern Baptist could say to a Catholic that would convince the Catholic that he or she was wrong. Because that would mean you'd have to be convinced that the Pope was a fraud and wasn't actually a special conduit of God.
Right. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Oh, well, he seems to spend a decent part of this section talking about human exceptionalism, because that seems to be, as I think we just sort of covered, at any point along the way, the inconsistencies that faith has with science is just as good of a reason to reject faith as it is at any other point along the way. But Coyne gives some special attention to human exceptionalism, because the argument seems to be, and he even cites Alfred Russel Wallace, who is the co-discoverer of natural selection with Darwin, as giving some sort of special credence to the brain of modern humans, like that one specific organ in that one specific species seems to be outside of the abilities of natural selection. But of course, that doesn't really seem, as Coyne argues, that there doesn't seem to be strong evidence for that.
No, not at all. Many species can do things that they weren't, specifically selected to do. He talks about the work of crows, in different species that can do all kinds of things, solve puzzles, do basic addition and subtraction. I mean, chimps can do, can learn can learn sign language. I mean, all of this, suggests that there's nothing peculiar about humans in that regard.
Right.
Now, the next section is, this is another effort to make the circle square from Coyne's perspective. This business of, whether humans were inevitable. See, many religious people have argued, many religious evolutionary scientists have argued that humans are inevitable. Why would they argue that? Because there needs to be a way in which humans are special in the sense of above and beyond all other life forms. And if it can be documented that humans were an inevitable outcome of evolution by natural selection, well, then that makes them somehow special. See? But once again, there's just no clear evidence that humans were inevitable. That means that they were destined to evolve. People have made arguments, but I think they're, Coyne makes the case that, you can make the argument that humans were inevitable, but it's not a very powerful argument. And at any rate, it's very difficult to test because you'd have to to really test it, you'd have to sort of rewind the tape. And of course, nobody can do that. So it's an argument that depends on the inability to test it. And that's maybe not a good reason to believe something is true, simply because it's impossible to show that it's false.
Yes. I think that's probably the strongest point made in this section, but I also really liked, because I sort of, before reading this section, had a sense that the evolution of humans was sort of inevitable in like a deterministic sense, or in other words, the sense that it was inevitable because it happened and it only happened once.
Well,
and,
right.
But even that he sort of takes to task, saying how on like a quantum level, and I'm not very well versed in quantum physics or chemistry at all, but he says that, even on a quantum level, there is like a degree of randomness in the fluctuation of, I think, electrons or quarks or something,
Right.
that even makes that idea in a deterministic sense a little shakier than I once thought. So
Sure.
I think he made a good case that, even I found really compelling, that human evolution is very much not, or was not, inevitable.
Yeah. Or at a minimum, we simply don't know.
Right.
It can't be definitively tested. So it's an area that, again, I think it relies, to the extent that it has any power as an argument, it relies on our inability to test it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a poor reason to, Coyne's argument, that's a poor reason to take on board a set of beliefs, because they can't be tested and therefore falsified. So the last section, he deals with theological problems with theistic evolution. These are religious people's problems with theistic evolution. He talks about, remember, theistic evolution is in some ways analogous to, or it's a good example of Gould's, in some ways, Gould's non-overlapping magisteria, in the sense that it's an example of an idea in principle that you would think a lot of people would really appreciate, theistic evolution. But the problem is that evolutionary scientists have incredible difficulties with theistic evolution for the reasons that he lays out. But then religious people have, a whole slew of theological difficulties with theistic evolution. So it's not clear that it's quite as accommodationist as it might at first appear to be.
Right. That's a good point. Because even I think that is more or less to say that even if scientists did make all of these sort of concessions for religion, or as he argues a lot in this book, a lot of scientists who personally reject any sort of religion make public concessions to sort of pull more people under the umbrella. There's still a lot more pulling in the other direction in the theistic communities.
Right, absolutely. Okay, so how about if we move on to chapter 4, Faith Strikes Back?
Yep.
So here, I kind of summarized this for myself. I have a note to myself at the beginning of this chapter. This chapter brings together the common criticisms or critiques of science. Okay, the way that religious people will push back against science. Okay, or at least some of the common sort of criticisms of science that are purported to therefore make religion more attractive, I suppose. Or to make religion more attractive insofar as you can denigrate or undercut, the utility of science. It's another strategy that has been attempted in this, back and forth in this discussion between science and religion. There are huge literatures, that Coyne summarizes some of this in chapter 4. Religious people pushing back against science. If there was no conflict between science and religion, then why all this effort to push back against science and to denigrate science and to make science less attractive? It does suggest that there actually are some important conflicts and potentially some important incompatibilities between science and religion. Right?
Yes.
Yeah. So let's just take these. He also does a nice job, I think, of breaking this down into different sections.
Right.
So there are a variety of ways in which faith has, as he says, attempted to strike back against religion. And shall we just jump to the argument for God from fine-tuning? Or do you want to say something about some of those intervening pages there?
No, we can start there.
Okay.
On the fine-tuning.
Right. Just making sure I didn't gloss over something. So the fine-tuning argument for God, which is also known as the anthropic principle, makes the following claim, says Coyne. This is on page 160. Many of the constants of physics are such that if they differed even slightly, they would not permit the existence of our universe or the evolution and existence of humans, the object of God's creation. Now, because we do exist, the values of these constants are too improbable to be explained by science, which suggests that they were adjusted by God to make life possible. So the fine-tuning argument basically is that the universe has been fine-tuned by God, so that humans could exist, essentially. Okay? What's never specified is how do you know that God is the Christian God or the Muslim God or the Hindu God or gods or Thor? It's never clear. This is always unspoken. Whoever's making this fine-tuning argument just presumes that, well, the God that is doing all the fine-tuning is obviously, the Christian God, or obviously, the Muslim God, or obviously Shiva, or one of the Hindu gods. But of course, there's absolutely no evidence for that.
Right.
Preferably focusing on one version or one type of God. And this is what happens when, this is a slightly more sophisticated argument for the existence of God. And again, it turns on our current state of knowledge such that we don't know why the universe appears to have has the constants that it does. And so this is a classic God of the gaps argument. So God God is used as the placeholder for, well, God is presumed to be the explanation for the existence of these constants. The problem with that argument is that we might actually discover, a scientific, evidence-based account of why the constants are as they are. Then that forces people who are arguing God did it, it forces them to then push back further, right? And say, well, okay, fine, he didn't fine tune, the constants, but maybe he, sort of seeded the universe itself. Maybe he snapped his fingers, or maybe Thor bashed his hammer, and made the universe poof into existence. Well, that's another God of the gaps argument that's relying on our current ignorance of the explanation, for that particular, for the origin of the universe, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So, but at any rate, it's an argument. This argument for God from fine tuning. This is, an argument that lives. It's made by some very smart people. And, but what Coyne is asking us to do is to appreciate that this is another version of the God of the gaps argument.
Yep. And he makes the counter argument that, for the several, whatever universal constants or sort of requirements for life that do exist in the universe, there are other more flexible constants that people don't bring up when making the argument. They're not every aspect of the universe and the requirements for life on a planet like ours are as sort of narrow.
That's right.
I'm not sure which exactly.
Several of them can be twiddled.
Right.
Could be with. If you run the equations, if you do the math, that it doesn't, disqualify, the existence of the universe as we know it.
Right.
So at any rate, I think for students who are interested, there's a fairly broad literature assessing the so-called fine-tuning arguments from both sides, those who are making them and those who are basically arguing against them. But they ultimately turn on our ignorance of the evidence-based or logical explanation for why the constants are the way they are. I mean, if you're going to make this argument, you better hope that we never, why the universe has the particular constants that it does. Because if we find that out, then God will become superfluous. You don't need to, if you have an evidence-based explanation, then there's no need for the hypothesis of God at that point. And so that's why many religious people, many theologians, as Coyne refers to them, many sophisticated theologians, don't like these fine-tuning arguments because they think it's too risky. They basically say, don't do this, don't put God in these gaps, because when these gaps are filled, and they are likely to be filled, there's no guarantee, but they're likely to be filled, just as every other gap has been filled by science, you're going to find yourself painted into a corner. So at any rate, there are naysayers about these arguments on both sides, the science, the scientific community and the religious community.
Right. Yeah, there's a bad track record for the God of the gaps argument.
That's right. So Coyne takes us through several other arguments. So he takes us through the argument from fine-tuning, the argument for God from morality, and essentially notes that there's a huge literature that has evolved over the last 2,000 years, investigating, and particularly the last this century, where there's been a lot of very careful and thoughtful work on the evolution and sort of the workings of morality. And it doesn't appear to require, you know, religious intervention to understand and to explain moral principles, including moral universals. Once again, it was, this notion of morality being evidence for God turned on our ignorance of, the evolution and production of morals and values and ethics. Well, now that we're getting a better handle on this, within the scientific community, it makes, a religious explanation, not especially useful. It doesn't add anything. And that's, again, just one of the problems with these God of the Gaps arguments. I mean, there's now a huge field of moral psychology. Never mind 2,000 years of philosophy, secular philosophy, that's sort of been digging into, the origins of our morals and values and ethics.
Right. And is Coyne here combating the argument made by theistic people that religion is responsible for inherent morals, or just overall preferable or good morality? Because that seems like such a shaky argument to make for any one religion, that yours prescribes the correct moral sort of code.
Yeah, I think he's arguing against both sets of tenets. Especially the thing is, that's a really weak argument, to argue that a particular religion is responsible for the now universally known, sort of principles of morality. Something like, the golden rule, treat others as you wish to be treated. That's not a Christian rule.
Right. That
is a rule or a moral principle that is followed in every single culture for which we have data. The Ache of Paraguay, were practicing the golden rule, okay, well before they had ever heard about Jesus Christ. Never mind, the evidence, the centuries of evidence before Christ existed, assuming he did exist, that, Chinese, early Asian peoples were promulgating and practicing the so-called golden rule, treating others as you wish to be treated. And we haven't even talked about evidence for the golden rule in non-human primates.
Right.
There's very good evidence that humans aren't peculiar in, sort of holding up this notion that, treating others as you wish is a laudable principle.
Right. Yeah, but it is good evidence for the evolution of morals, or a moral
Sure.
Brain in primates, including humans.
Yes, absolutely. Well, then Coyne moves on to the argument for God from true beliefs and rationality. The argument here is that to the extent that we can have true beliefs, well, that proves God exists. And not just any God, but the Christian God, or the Muslim God, or the Hindu gods. Once again, there's simply nothing, in any of these arguments that, commits one to specifically the Christian God. But there's very good evidence that natural selection doesn't build true beliefs. And this is on page 182. Actually, he says, natural selection doesn't mold true beliefs. It molds the sensory and neural apparatus that in general promotes the formation of true beliefs. But of course, we've seen that not all of our beliefs are true. That's because while natural selection has given us a pretty good truth-detecting apparatus, that apparatus can also be fooled, as in the checker shadow illusion, okay, and many other visual illusions. It's easy to trick, humans into seeing one thing, to illusorily seeing something that isn't there. providing evidence that our beliefs are not always correct. They're not always true. And religion could be one of the false beliefs that piggybacks on evolution. Okay, so there's simply no evidence that our minds are built to unfailingly guide us to true beliefs. So the whole argument, is built on, an assumption that appears not to be true.
Right. Well, and even to the extent that we can find some amount of truth in the natural world, I don't see as strong evidence for God. And I'm not really sort of confused as to where that argument itself comes from. But, I mean, I guess I can sort of see why that sort of truth seeking or knowing ability might seem sort of divine, I guess, if that is in fact the argument that's made.
That does seem to be the argument. And I think the other problem with that is, right, I mean, I think, why should the fact that the human mind, usually does a pretty good job ferreting out truth, how is that evidence for a supernatural, architect or supernatural designer? I mean, humans aren't the only species that generally behave in a way that suggests they have access to the truth of what's going on around them, And so, but that's inconvenient for people who are making this argument to document that, hey, chimpanzees' brains seem to be designed to guide them to the truth, to eat what's good and not what's poisonous, to seek to copulate with a fertile member of the species rather than an infertile member of the species. I mean, chimpanzees seem to be guided by a brain that is an accurate truth detector. And now you're going to argue, and therefore God exists? Well, that's a problem if you want humans to be uniquely special, right? And so most versions of Christianity are built on this notion that humans were made in the image of God. Well, how in the world are you going to account for the truth detection of chimpanzees now? And it's just a messy, weak argument.
No, I agree. And are there any other points in this section that he addresses that you think are worth spending time on?
Are you talking about in the chapter or before we get to the...
Oh, just in this section on, I don't even know where... argument for God from true beliefs and rationality.
Yeah, I think we've tackled what we want to tackle there. Let's talk for a moment about the section, starts on page 185, is science the only way of knowing?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this, of course, is a very well-known kind of argument that's not made by, well, often religionists, people will argue that, no, I mean, religion is a different way of knowing. It's another way of knowing. But it's, for the world, it's not clear that that's actually the case. And it doesn't even have to be a religious, perspective. I mean, he goes on, and towards the end of this section, he talks about whether literature, or poetry or music might be thought of as a different way of knowing, like as an alternative to science. And it's just not clear that it is a different way of knowing. I mean, this is Coyne's argument, is that, no, it can give you a different perspective. It can give you, a different appreciation for life or, what's out there. But it's not going to tell you anything uniquely novel and true about the world. This is Coyne's argument anyways.
Yeah, and I think I agree with that. He does a bit of sort of defining that I think is important for his
Right.
ability to persuade me, at least, on this argument. But I think the way in which he does define a way of knowing as gaining knowledge through empirical, testable claims,
Right.
then no, I think art and like the various forms of art and philosophy and um, well, mostly those are not really ways of knowing in the same way that science is, which is not to say that they cannot be appreciated for their ability to give different perspectives or to inspire or even to inform your sense of morality or what's right and wrong potentially.
Right.
Art could do these things, but that's again not a way of knowing in the same way that science and the scientific method is.
Right. Absolutely. Right. In terms of, replicating, empirical tests of ideas that could be falsified if they're wrong. So then this last section, I think, or one of the later sections, the next section, the next big section addresses this business of scientism and what is meant by scientism. This is an accusation that non-scientists typically make against science that basically is sort of the accusation that you're trying to explain too much, or you're stepping outside of where science should be applied. Um, it's always used as a derogatory sort of dig. The argument that you know you're being too scientific, or it's always used as as a as a as a derogation, as something bad. Um, but again, if we talk about, we can look at how he defines it here and how he sort of lays it out. So scientism, according to Coyne, on page 198, scientism usually denotes one or more of the following four claims. First, science is the sole source of reliable facts about the universe. That is, it's the only reliable way of knowing. That's not. Why is that negative? At any rate, alternatively, scientism could mean, the four different ways of talking about it, right? Alternatively, scientism could mean that the humanities should be subsumed under the rubric of science. It could also refer to the idea that questions that can't be answered by science aren't worth considering or discussing. The most damning definition of scientism, according to Coyne, is the idea that scientists are arrogant, lack humility, and are reluctant to admit that their findings might be wrong. So it's just a way of sort of denigrating science by sort of throwing at them, this is just scientism. You're just trying to be you're arrogant. You're trying to explain too much.
Right. And it's he also says on that previous at the end of the previous page 197 that a successful accusation of scientism usually relies upon a restrictive conception of the sciences and an optimistic conception of the arts as hitherto practiced. Nobody espouses scientism. It's just detected in the writings of others. So it
Right.
is sort of an attack. No one ever tries to make the argument that science should overstep its boundaries. I mean, of course they don't. But even sort of to anticipate the arguments of people who do criticize science or scientific thinkers or writers for being guilty of scientism, I think that there could be, I'm sure there could be instances of individuals maybe being overambitious, or as
Sure.
he explains in the fourth claim of scientism, that scientists could be arrogant or reluctant to admit that their findings might be wrong. And but of course that's not a good reason to denounce science as a whole or the scientific method, because there have been bad actors within science, as there have been, within every field, within every religion, or category of art or politics or whatever.
Right. Right. What's interesting is that those bad actors in science have been ferreted out by scientists, showing that they were bad actors, showing that they were wrong, that they've, that they cooked their books, that they made up the data, or that they were fraudulently sort of promoting their ideas. I mean, it's scientists that typically unravel the poor work that's occasionally done by scientists.
Yeah.
So he gives several sort of modes along which science has been attacked by religionists, typically by religionists. He talks about on page 204, science is based on faith. Aha! This is what he first was at tu koke, right? This is basically like when religious people say, oh yeah, well science is based on faith too. You have faith, that your scientific method works. You have faith that, evolution did occur. But that's a very different use of the word faith. I mean, faith typically means belief not based on evidence, or belief without evidence, or belief that's inconsistent with evidence. Faith in science is another way of saying, we have confidence in the scientific method. We don't believe anything, or we believe something or assent to something to the extent that the empirical evidence warrants it.
Right, and it's based on. Sorry, my camera was flickering. It's based on previous evidence, and this is where I think his explanation of science as a provisional method, which is very much different from religion or religion's ways of knowing. Science as a provisional method gives faith, or a better term, confidence, that you will continue to see findings that are consistent with the evidence you've seen before. But because it is provisional, you are able to, or you must, in a scientific theory, change the theory to fit data that is inconsistent.
Right. That's right. And that's a profound difference. Or it's not to say there aren't religions that, alter their tenets, but that's, that's more hit or miss with religion. It is part and parcel of the domain of science, is trashing, premises that are shown to be false. They're shown to be false. Where the evidence doesn't support something, one does not believe it.
Right. And I don't. He doesn't really get into it, but I think a large part of this argument frequently is claiming, and he talks a little bit about it on 209, when Daniel Sarowitz claimed that the belief in the Higgs boson is an act of faith, not of rationality, and compared it to Hindu belief in a sea of milk. He was simply wrong, and I think that's a good point there, that people will criticize science for, if something is theoretical, or if you haven't observed it with your eyes literally, then it's, you're taking it on faith. But that's wrong, basically for the same reasons we've stated, that it's based on previous evidence, or if you are making a scientific argument about something that may not be exactly in your field, and you haven't yourself pored over the data, you're trusting, based on previous evidence, the scientific community that has consistently produced, tested and retested and scrutinized scientific claims by an entire community that
Right.
Agrees upon them. It's not one person, or even a conspiracy of people, of scientists in physics or evolutionary biology, cooking their books and supporting dubious findings. These are things that claims that everyone within a community are constantly trying to knock down. So,
Right.
Yeah.
Very different mode of operation. Now, let me just point out the last three sort of sections. These are, again, attempts to undermine science, um, often motivated by religious sort of beliefs. It's sort of the argument being this is one strategy. If you can't accommodate your religion to the scientific evidence, well, then one path would be to poke at the evidence or poke at science itself. So on page 211, he discusses religion, the argument that religion gave rise to science. I mean, this is sort of a weak attempt to make them compatible, I suppose. Then the next section is science does bad things. So these are purported to be reasons why, I think, reasons why we shouldn't, rely on scientific evidence, because it was religion, after all, that gave rise to science. Science can do bad things. And then the final one, he argues that science is fallible and its results are unreliable. This is another dig. Let me just say one thing about that last one there. Science is fallible. It's not so much. Science turns on, science progresses on the basis of identifying where there are, domains of ignorance. I mean, it's not a bad thing to identify that we don't know something. In fact, that's when the most interesting science gets done. Results that are not reliable are not, we simply don't put as much weight on their likely truth value. To the extent that a series of results can be replicated across different labs with different methodologies by different actors, I mean, that suggests that it's worth putting a little more weight on that evidence.
I think that's also a good point to explain, because there were actually a couple discussion questions about the reading last week that seemed to be a little confused as to why ignorance, or admitting ignorance, is a virtue in science but not in faith. Or people tried to, I think, make that comparison. Well, if admitting ignorance is a value or a virtue of science, why isn't that the case with faith? And I think it would be a virtue of faith if faith was committed to investigating or looking for holes or ignorance in its theories and its truth claims about the universe, but it isn't really.
Right. I mean, whereas it is almost in principle, how science moves forward. Mm-hmm. And there's no shame in saying, I don't know. I mean, the alternative is to say, implicitly, I don't know, but I'm going to assume that Thor did it. Or I'm going to assume that, some other god or goddess did it. Or the Christian God did it. And that's just compounding. I mean, you still don't know. All you're doing is just claiming, by fiat that God did it, with no evidence to suggest other than what's written in a holy book. But again, for example, written in a holy book. But that's not evidence if you aren't already committed to that book actually being, the Word of God, for example.
Right.
I mean, you're not going to convince. Many Muslims aren't going to be convinced of the truth value of Christianity by showing them where it says in the Bible such and such is true. They're going to say, yeah, but let me show you in the Quran where it says this is true. And so you're going to be talking past each other. And there's no evidence that can, be the arbiter of who's true, who's got the truth. Meanwhile, you've got the Thorians come along and saying, yes, but I can tell you where this came from. It came from Thor. Thor was the one who said this or that. Well, why would you think that? Well, because it's been written. It's written. It was written on stone, And that's, it's not a powerful way to argue. Yeah, okay. Are we okay with that then?
Yeah, I think that covers that point.
So the last chapter is why does it matter? Can we move on to the last chapter then, Gavin?
Yep, yep.
So why does it matter that science and religion are incompatible to the extent that they are? And Coyne spends quite a bit of time talking about child abuse, for example, faith as a substitute for medicine. So here's an obvious case where science and religion are incompatible. You can't both get appropriate modern medical treatment and deny the use of appropriate modern medical treatment. They're on the ground incompatible with one another. And, I think it matters. It matters because children die. Children who don't have a mature say in whether they do or do not wish to have modern medical treatment die when parents disallow medical treatment and instead pray over them.
Right. And
Um,
it's the direct responsibility of faith or faith-based thinking. And, to me, this chapter is Coyne making the argument that this book, his arguments matter outside of an academic setting. These
that's right.
arguments do not just matter for people who care about convincing others of the truth of evolution by natural selection or other scientific claims. It matters for real American people who are doubtful of science based on their faith.
And that's fine so long as that didn't have an impact on anybody else. But it does. And these people with these beliefs then sometimes can very negatively affect their children by not seeking medical treatment. Um, and that's morally questionable, right? It may not be legally questionable in the sense that in most states, if a behavior is engaged in for religious reasons, the disallowance of medical treatment, for example, that often sets it aside and it doesn't count as child abuse. Whereas if the same behavior were done without without religious backing, well, then that would qualify as, legally defined child abuse or neglect, and that just doesn't seem right.
Right.
That's what he's arguing here. So there's a problem there.
Well, and he even attacks the legal aspect, saying that because of religious sort of sympathy, the legal system is set up in a way to tolerate to a degree that he argues, and I agree, is way more, I guess, yeah, way more tolerant than it really should be of people who deny their children modern medical care based on or for religious reasons.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's right. And he makes a distinction. Look, if an adult wants to deny themselves medical treatments and instead they want to pray, well, that's fine. I mean, some people would argue that's fine because you control your body, you are in charge of yourself. But when it comes to inflicting those beliefs on children who don't have a legal medical say in what's going on, that's where Coyne and many others, have a real problem, including many Christians, by the way. I don't want to suggest that, many religious people think this is wrong. But many religious people think it's right, that parents should be able to, torture their children, if they want, on the basis of a set of beliefs.
Right. And he sort of extends that argument to opposition to assisted dying, where, religious, lawmakers and other sorts of people actually do interfere with an individual's ability to seek treatment or, euthanasia for terminal illnesses because of, for religious reasons.
Right. Yeah. So these are all of these domains are evidence that it does matter. And this is Coyne's argument. It does matter that science and religion butt heads. It's not just an intellectual game, but it actually matters in terms of the suffering, of real people, of individual people. And he goes on to discuss global warming denialism. It can have significant fallout, to deny the science that clearly, documents, the existence of global warming attributable to human action. All of this leads him to ask, then, does faith have any value? Might it have a special value? Might it provide solace? Might it, help, cohere groups? Might it provide community? And he argues that it might do these things, but he also argues that the cost is too large. Now that's his argument. And he says, let's see, might it have any value? Let me see. There's a section I wanted to point out. Yeah, he talks about the trade-off between consolation and practicality. Just because, certainly there can be instances in which faith, that is, belief in something without evidence, can be consoling. But that doesn't therefore mean that in an unqualified way we should prop up faith, because there are costs to faith, such as, disallowing modern medical treatment or interfering with science and, the reduction of suffering for those that suffer from diseases. I think at a minimum, he's arguing that, we must appreciate that while there may be benefits, there also are costs.
Yeah. He says at one point, in terms of the benefits or the consoling power of religion, no one's trying to argue that you should be trying to convert religious people on their deathbed, and
right.
No atheists really that he knows of are going around and trying to do that. But in terms of the costs, you are really, a better way to look at it probably is the benefits of being less religious. And he cites Northern Europe as a very good example, I think, of being one of the least religious places in the world, I think, and being extremely well off, even in terms of the other European countries, and especially in terms or in comparison to the United States.
Yes, no, absolutely. Well, so all of this then leads him to ask on page 256, can there be a dialogue between science and faith? And I think we can summarize his argument in one paragraph on page 257. He says, he asks, nevertheless, is it possible to have a constructive dialogue? My response is that anything useful will come from a monologue, one in which science does all the talking and religion does the listening. This is what I mean by it's very clear what he's arguing. Further, the monologue will be constructive only for the listener. While scientists can learn more about the nature of belief by talking to the faithful, those benefits can accrue to anyone who wants to learn more about religion. In contrast, religion has nothing to tell scientists that can improve their trade. Indeed, the progress of science has required shedding all vestiges of religion, whether those be the beliefs themselves or religious methods for finding, quote, truth. We do not need those hypotheses. So you won't have where he stands on that. No, there cannot be a dialogue, not a constructive dialogue. There can be a monologue with with science speaking and religion listening.
Right.
That should not be surprising. That is his, that flows seamlessly from the arguments he's built throughout this book.
And I think it might sound surprising to some people, and it may sound extreme, but like you said, up to this point in the book, I don't think it is surprising. I think it is consistent with everything he's argued up to this point. And I think it's also a very reasonable argument, given what he's laid out thus far.
Yeah. But I think it also, of course, leaves room for people to fight with it, to struggle with it, and that's precisely what we'll ask you to do on the final exam. There will be one question from Coyne's book, broadly cast, to give you, the students, an opportunity to struggle with it and to demonstrate that even if you don't agree with Coyne, you understand what he's arguing. That's what we're asking, is that you understand and grapple with the arguments that Coyne is making. And the same is true for the other three books. Okay, so again, just to be clear, we'll say more about the final. The final exam will likely include 4 essay questions. You'll have all of your materials to work with. It's a take-home exam. One question from each book. One question from Darwin, one question from Dawkins, one question from Coyne, and one question from Benatar, the book that we'll discuss next week. All right. Well, anything further we want to add, Gavin?
No, I think that about covers it.
Well, all right then. So next week we will discuss Benatar and his arguments for the human predicament. In the meantime, by the time you're watching this, Gavin will have posted the videos for this week. And as before, you're more than welcome to include, or do we want them to include reference to the videos in their reaction paper, Gavin?
Yes.
Okay. So that will help us sort of feel confident that you actually took the time to watch the videos. I mean, I can only say it in so many ways that these really will be useful. Watching these videos, we've been very careful about, which videos we're asking you to watch. And, the goal is to give you another opportunity to think about these issues, from, in this case, listening, hearing from someone different in a different venue, in a different context, the goal of which is to, give you, more to sort of grapple with, to better understand the arguments that are being made, whether you agree with them or not. Okay. Excuse me. So we will pick it back up then next week.
All right.